Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor, where it's the Robert E. Howard Show. It's the Robert E. Howard Show once again. And today we're going to be talking about something I should have talked about by now, which is the Del Rey set of Robert E. Howard. This is a set of books I've talked a lot about since I've started my channel and started talking about Robert E. Howard, because this is the best publication of Robert E. Howard's fiction that you can find, the best set of books that you can find of Robert E. Howard. And it's been a while, actually, now since this set was published. The last volume in this set was published in 2011. We're due, actually, for a new set of Robert E. Howard books, but it doesn't look like we're going to be getting any for a while. I haven't heard anything about any new publications of Robert E. Howard's work. So this is still the best you can get, this Del Rey set of Robert E. Howard's fiction. It's not perfect. It could have used at least one more volume. It's missing some things that I think it should have. But I'm pretty happy with what we got with this Del Rey set. It was based on some books published by Wandering Star, which was a British publisher, I believe. And they published some hardcover volumes. They published the Conan set, they published Solomon Kane, and they published Bran Mak Morn, I believe. And all of those were reprinted by Del Rey in this set of books. And then Del Rey added to those books with some other volumes. They ended up with 11 volumes. Like I said, they could have used at least one more, but they're great. They're great volumes. So really happy to have them. And I remember in 2002 when this came out, I remember buying this and being thrilled and buying these books as they were released. This is by far the best edition of Conan that you can get. They published 3 volumes of Conan, which contain every scrap that Robert E. Howard ever wrote about the character. All the stories. It has fragments that Robert E. Howard never finished about Conan. It has the essay, which became a story, The Hyborian Age, about Conan's world. Just wonderful, wonderful volumes. Published in the order of composition. So they were published in the order that Robert E. Howard wrote the stories, which is important. Because some Conan stories were never published originally until after Robert E. Howard's death. And the publication history of Conan as a character has been kind of problematic. Mostly due to L. Sprague de Camp and the way he edited the set of books that he put out of Conan. I will talk more about that at another time. But Conan became popular mostly due to the Lancer books that had those great covers by Frank Frazetta. But the issue with that set of books was that L. Sprague de Camp put in pastiche fiction written by himself and by Lynn Carter, and he mixed that in with the original Robert E. Howard stories, which was a problem. I mean, nobody would think of doing that, for example, with Sherlock Holmes. Nobody would think of putting out a Sherlock Holmes set which had a bunch of pastiche Sherlock Holmes fiction mixed in with the original stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I mean, it shouldn't have been done with Robert E. Howard's Conan either. And I don't have anything against pastiche Conan. But I do have a problem with putting pastiche Conan in volumes of Robert E. Howard's original Conan stories. And then that being the only edition of Conan that you can get. And that was the way it was for years and years and years. This was very welcome when this 3-volume set was published, where we can get everything in 3 volumes that Robert E. Howard wrote about this character. The real deal, the real Conan. And like all of these Del Rey volumes, it is very beautifully illustrated. This one is illustrated by Mark Schultz. And just really nice. It has illustrations at the heads of the stories and the chapters. Really, really good ones. And so they're beautiful books to look at. This one's from the Tower of the Elephant. And they're just wonderful volumes. And because of that. So this was the first Conan volume that was published. The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian. Then we got The Bloody Crown of Conan. And this edition is published by Gary Gianni. And again, some beautiful artwork in this volume. Really cool stuff. So this is the second volume of Conan, and then they finished out the set of Conan stories with this volume, the Conquering Sword of Conan, the Conquering Sword of Conan. And this volume has illustrations by Gregory Manches. Really nice ones too, in a very different style than the last one. All of the illustrators have very different styles, which makes it kind of cool. There's Conan all done up as a pirate, and this is from the story The Black Stranger, which is not in the public domain, more piratey stuff, and it's kind of a pirate Conan story. And so you won't see that in a lot of the public domain cheapy editions of Conan, which are so prevalent nowadays. Just some great stuff. Some great illustrations in this volume. And this ends the Conan series, so we have a nice set of 3 Conan books. If you get these 3, you have everything you need for Conan, really, because that's all of the Robert E. Howard stuff. And like I said before, I'm not against pastiche Conan, but Robert E. Howard's Conan is the real deal. And you should have a set or a volume of Conan where it's just Robert E. Howard's Conan, the real thing. And then read pastiche Conan as you like, just knowing it's not the real thing. Also, we have his other great fantasy characters were also published. So this is the Savage Tales of Solomon Kane, which I believe, I could be wrong, but I think in the Wandering Star set, this came out before the Conan did. I think this came out in the late 90s, the original Wandering Star edition. Yeah, 1998. Which explains why this volume looks a little different as far as how it's designed. It has a bunch of illustrations that are really great, but it's all kind of mixed in with the text, which you don't see so much in the other volumes. But they're beautiful little illustrations, all by, all the illustrations are by Gary Gianni. And this one, look at that wonderful title page. That's awesome. And so this has everything by this has everything by Robert E. Howard of Solomon Kane, the entire Solomon Kane series. It all fits in one little book. And over the years, Solomon Kane has been published in paperback, here and there, and some Solomon Kane fragments were finished by Ramsey Campbell in some earlier editions of Solomon Kane. This does not have that. This has only Robert E. Howard's work in it. So the fragments that were never finished of Solomon Kane, and there were a couple, remain unfinished. So this has all of the Solomon Kane stories and the unfinished fragments and the poems which Robert E. Howard wrote about Solomon Kane. So this is everything of Solomon Kane that Robert E. Howard actually wrote. So it's a wonderful volume. This is a great character. I've talked a lot about this character before on the Robert E. Howard Show. Wonderful illustrations, a very nicely designed book. So it's cool. This is a very cool volume. Then we got Bran Mak Morn, the Last King. Bran Mak Morn, the Pictish king, he united his people to fight against Rome. This is a wonderful character, and again, beautifully illustrated by Gary Gianni. It's excellent. and doesn't have quite as many illustrations in this one, but the illustrations that are in here are really nice. This has all of the stories that have anything to do with Bran Mak Morn. Really nicely done. Beautifully illustrated. This has Worms of the Earth and the Dark Man and some other stories that are just kind of related to the Picts. And it has a lot of stuff in here. You have an original typescript that was reproduced in here. So a lot of cool stuff. And we've got some extra art at the end. Some extra illustrations that Gianni did when working for this character, kind of a sketchbook at the end. So, beautiful book. By far the best edition of the Bran Mak Morn stories that you could find in this one. Same can be said for Kull, Exile of Atlantis. Now, this has illustrations by Justin Sweet, and they're really nice because he gives quite a different visual, he gives you quite a different visual take on Kull and his world in this volume. It's a relatively slim book because Robert E. Howard didn't write a lot of Kull stories. Most of these were never published in his lifetime. But everything that he wrote about Kull can be found in this book. Really nice. And again, an earlier edition of Kull came out that was highly edited, and it had some stories that were finished. I believe it was by Lynn Carter, if I'm remembering correctly. This only has the original Kull stories written by Robert E. Howard. So only Robert E. Howard stuff in here, just like with the rest of the set. And really, really beautiful book with some wonderful artwork. If you're interested in the character of Kull, and you should be if you're interested in Robert E. Howard, this is the edition to get. Of course, it starts off with the Shadow Kingdom, which is considered by many to be the first sword and sorcery story. Sword and sorcery, Robert E. Howard is considered the father of sword and sorcery. And it's magnificent. One of the best things that Robert E. Howard ever wrote. So, very happy that this was published. Then we get some other cool stuff. For example, we get El Borac and Other Desert Adventures. And this has all the stories of the Texan El Borac, who went to the Middle East and had a bunch of adventures. So he was an American who went to the Middle East. And this character, Francis Xavier Gordon, also known as El Borac. And this also has some stories of Kirby O'Donnell and Steve Clarney. So all of the American adventurers in the Middle East who had adventures, they're all put in this one book. And it's been a while. It had been a while since these were published. A lot of these were published in the 1970s and into the 1980s. When was this volume published? This volume was published in 2010. And so this was a very welcome volume again. This has some artwork by Tim Bradstreet and Jim and Ruth Keegan. An odd combination because their art styles are so different. This is Bradstreet right there, and Jim and Ruth Keegan did the cover. Now their versions of El Borac are very different from each other, but all great artwork. I mean, just some great stuff in this. It's very pulpy adventure fiction from the 30s. And so, yeah, El Borac and Other Desert Adventures. Highly recommend it because these are some Robert E. Howard stories that aren't as read as a lot of his fantasy stuff. This straight adventure fiction. Not as many people have read this, and I highly recommend it because if you like his other stuff, if you like Conan, you'll probably really like this stuff. It's good stuff. Del Rey also came out with some best of volumes. This is the horror stories of Robert E. Howard. which collects most of Robert E. Howard's horror stories. It's a wonderful volume, which really showcases some of his best horror stories. There is some duplication here if you have the other Del Rey volumes, because there's Worms of the Earth is in here, for example, which is a Bran Mak Morn story. It has some Solomon Kane stories in here, because some of Solomon Kane's stories are basically horror stories, most of them. And it has a ton of other stuff, though. It's an excellent volume to have. I love it. The horror stories of Robert E. Howard. This is an excellent volume. I'm very glad they came out with this one, just because there's so much cool stuff in here. The Black Stone, which could be his best horror story, other than, well, Worms of the Earth is probably his best. It's a tough call. This is a great volume. I did a video just on this, I think, if I'm remembering right. They also came out with a 2-volume set of the best of Robert E. Howard, which was interesting, and I'm still not sure if that was the best idea. But they did come out with a 2-volume set of the best of Robert E. Howard, all wonderfully illustrated by Jim and Ruth Keegan. This is Volume 1, Crimson Shadows. Then you have Volume 2, The Grimlands. And it's just packed full of some wonderful Robert E. Howard stories. A lot of them which are not available in the other Del Rey volumes, but a lot of them that are. So again, you have a lot of duplication. And the thing about the best of volumes, I kind of think this should have just been 1 volume. I think when they were doing it, they were like, well, there's just too much, there's too many great Robert E. Howard stories. We can't just fit them all in 1 volume. So they came up with 2, because it would be too big to put it all in 1. But the thing about a best of volume, this is the kind of thing that if somebody is unfamiliar with Robert E. Howard, you can give them and say, hey, read this. This will give you a taste of this character and what this character is all about. To do that now, you have to give them both, you know. And so I'm not sure doing a 2-volume set was the best. I think it would have been better just to come up with 1 volume and just do the work to narrow down those stories, and maybe have less duplication of stories if you already have the other Del Rey volumes, although that might be impossible. They could have cut it down to 1 volume and then come up with another volume of Del Rey, which would include some things that you don't get in the Del Rey set. They did conclude the set. The very last book that came out in the set, I believe, was this one. This is Sword Woman and Other Historical Adventures. Robert E. Howard wrote a lot of historical stories, adventure stories, that were not fantasy, and they were not horror. They were just straight historical adventure stories, including this one, Sword Woman. A lot of these stories, or some of these stories at least, were taken by L. Sprague de Camp and turned into Conan stories. But you can find the original versions here in this volume. This one is illustrated by John Watkiss. Really, really cool illustrations. It's a really cool volume with so many great Robert E. Howard stories. And again, like the Bran Mak Morn volume, a lot of these stories, even people who have read Robert E. Howard, a lot of these stories are not frequently read. The Shadow of the Vulture, which has Red Sonja in it, who became Red Sonja. Red Sonja, who became Red Sonja for the comic book. Great stuff. This is an excellent volume. It was a good way to go out. There are a couple things that I think should have been included. I think they could have had 1 more volume of this, and I wish they did, because they did not publish Almuric, which was Robert E. Howard's kind of science fiction fantasy, his Sword and Planet story, which was actually the first Robert E. Howard book I read was Almuric. So they could have put that in there, and they could have put that in with Skullface, which is another pulp adventure-y type story, which was a pretty high quality, actually. They could have put Almuric, Skullface, and a few other stories that are not included in the Del Rey set. They could have easily, I think, come up with one more volume, but they didn't. This is all they did. As a set of books, it's fantastic, even though it is kind of incomplete. And of course, it doesn't contain, we don't have a volume from them on Robert E. Howard's boxing stories. We don't have a lot of his other stories, like he also wrote a lot of Westerns. They are not in this set. I'm not surprised, because this set concentrates on his fantasy and horror and adventure. But he did write other stuff, which are not part of this set. I do think it's time for a really nice new Robert E. Howard set of books. But like I said, I don't see any on the horizon. Titan Books has the rights to Robert E. Howard's characters now, but they seem to be concentrating more on pastiche fiction at the moment. They're doing the comic books about Conan and reprinting some of the Marvel comics. And they've come out already with one Conan pastiche novel. They're going to come out with another one. They're reprinting, Titan Books is, the movie novelization, which is interesting. But it would be great if they were to publish Robert E. Howard's original fiction. That would be cool. It would be nice to have a really nice new set, because like I said, this was published in 2011. The first volume was published in 2002. So this is an older set of books. And it's time, I think, for a new set from Robert E. Howard. But for right now, this set of books from Del Rey, it's still the best. And there you go. That's all I have to say today. I will catch you next time.